I wanted to know how do you evaluate the role of United States foreign policy during the years of unipolarity, which starts after the collapse of the Soviet Union up until 2017, we can this period of time.
There's really been a shift, and yet with the change, it's sort of that saying, the more things change, the more the essence stays the same. Because the precept, I think, of U.S. foreign policy, really since about the middle of the 20th century, is that it's the role of the United States to dominate as much of the world as possible. And there's all kinds of rhetoric about why that is appropriate. After all, the United States, we are told, is the beacon of freedom and democracy. We're told that the United States is indispensable. And that becomes a rationale, a rhetoric, an argument for the United States, first being, we were told, a bulwark against the tyranny of communism. And then after the fall of the Berlin Wall, so we're talking 3+ decades ago, it became a role that, as you referred to, now there is one superpower. And we've gone from a world with a multiplicity, or at least a duality of power blocks, to the United States. I remember there was a lot of rhetoric about the United States would and should stride the world like a colossus. And you can go back and hear some of the commentary in the US mass media in the early 1990s that under the end of the first Bush presidency and then the beginning of the Bill Clinton presidency, the United States was ascending to this unipolar world. And it certainly lent itself to the idea that things were going to keep going that way. And it's, of course, more difficult to run the world than it sometimes seems from the skyscrapers in Manhattan or the Capitol offices or the White House. And so I think that the United States government, with its military-industrial complex and its economic and geopolitical goals, has struggled to maintain the dominance, especially because even though its military strength is dominant of the world, certainly the strongest by far of the world, the most funded, the most military bases and so forth, the economic strength of the United States clearly is not what it used to be in relation to the rest of the world. So clearly the so-called BRIC countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, more and more giving the US and its economic powerhouses a run for their money. And to sort of sum up, I think that the United States government is still seeking to have economic and political and military dominance as much as possible, but running into more and more problems along the way.
Let's talk about Donald Trump. He got elected. We have, in my opinion, we have two presidents who were outsiders, Obama and Donald Trump. Both of them came to the power as an outsider, but became part of the blob during their presidency. I want to know, how do you see the difference between Donald Trump and Biden in their foreign policy? Do you see any difference between them?
Well, in terms of being outsiders and insiders, I mean, if we look at the last few presidencies, let's say in this century, even if they came from Texas or somewhere else, certainly we had George W. Bush, who was completely wired into being the insiders. He was, James Baker and others were immediately, as he aspired to be president, part of that whole apparatus. So the mentality, whatever the peculiarities of individual and personalities and so forth, the basics were these folks were insiders. And then we had Barack Obama, obviously the first Black president, very much an insider, quickly acclimated to the mentality. The rhetoric aside, he said when he was campaigning for president in 2008, I'm against dumb wars. Well, he just was against certain wars, but he was very much a militarist, as his policy showed. He actually escalated the U.S. war on Afghanistan and so forth. And then we get to Donald Trump. And Donald Trump, in a sense, is, quote unquote, an outsider, but he certainly acclimated himself to the military-industrial complex. The budget kept going up in terms of the Pentagon, and whatever personal peculiarities he had, and his warm rhetoric towards Vladimir Putin aside, actually very threatening policies towards Russia, and rhetoric aside, supportive of NATO, and the stationing of troops, the installment, the expansion of NATO, something very much supported, the installment of supposed defensive ABM systems in Romania and Poland, when actually they could easily be retrofitted to be aggressive offensive weapons on short notice along the Russian border. So, in some ways, we have the evidence that, yes, Trump was stylistically and sometimes rhetorically an outsider to some degree, but really part of the U.S. military-industrial complex. And, Biden has been an insider ever since he got to Washington 50 years ago. So how does that break down in terms of policy? I mean, I think that there are always adjustments being made, and there are disputes within ruling circles in the United States. But the policies are basically the same. I think, in contrast to 30 years ago, say, Washington is not transfixed with establishing and maintaining military dominance of Central America and Latin America. And so I think partly because the attention has been focused elsewhere, and partly because it wasn't viable, we don't have the overt repression supported in the Southern Cone and in Latin America. That was the case under even the very end of the Carter administration, certainly among the Reagan administration, the George Herbert Walker Bush administration. So there's variations, but I think underlying all this is that the U.S. foreign policy, in tandem with its economic concerns and support for resources, for favorable trade deals, for markets, and access to natural resources that can be mined and so forth, there's a tremendous determination to dominate as much of the world as possible.
We have this struggle inside the United States between Democrats and Republicans, but when it comes to the foreign policy, it doesn't make any difference for the people who are seeing United States from the outside. You see, we have somebody like Victoria Nuland. She's a neocon. She was in Bush administration, Obama's administration, Biden administration. It continues. And during Trump, we had a bunch of neocons. We had Bolton. We had Secretary of State Mike Pompeo. How these neocons got so powerful? It doesn't matter. It's Republican. It's Democrat. They are in power. They are always in power in the United States.
Well, Nima, I think those are very accurate observations, and it's a really good and important question. There is a split that sometimes really exists among the ruling circles in the United States, and it's a very useful differentiation between domestic policy and foreign policy. More than ever, there's a very important set of differences in policies domestically between the Republican and Democratic parties. And more than ever, the Republican Party is the party of white supremacy, of racism, of misogyny that's become extreme under Trump, and a more merciless version of class war internally within the boundaries of the United States. And so for people living in the United States, that's a very important difference. Who gets on the Supreme Court, whether abortion rights and reproductive rights are supported or attacked and undermined so many different ways. The war on the poor, the war on low-income people. Under Republicans, it is extreme. Under Democrats, it is, well, it's more mild, and there's some real support for working people within corporate limits. When it comes to foreign policy, while this has shifted over time, still, I think your observation is basically correct, that there is a core belief. You look at the military budget that has increased year after year, and I don't call it a defense budget. That's one of the Orwellian terms in the United States media and politics. We don't have a lowercase d defense budget. We have a military budget. If it was a defense budget, truly, it would be half the size of what it is. The United States has 750 military bases overseas. Russia has, what, 3 dozen? China maybe has 8 or 10. This is absurd, the extent to which the United States has military deployments and expenditures, but it's absurdity with a purpose. And what we're seeing now is that the Republican Party is opposing to some significant extent the spending for military aid to Ukraine. And I don't think it's particularly because the Republicans in Congress are less militaristic. I think it's partly because of the Democrats doing it in the White House. They don't like it. And also they want more of a clear, and I'm generalizing here, but Republicans in Congress generally want more of a pivot to China. They want to confront China. And so this is a falling out among militarists over those issues. To get back to that core issue, I mean, John Bolton is fairly unhinged. And he's somebody, excuse me, he's somebody who is has a long history of wanting to be bellicose towards Russia in particular. And he's a Republican. So when Trump began to at least rhetorically say nice things about Putin, then Bolton got very upset. So these are not monolithic blocks within the two parties. But I guess what I would say, and I would take your point and agree very much, that for people living in so many parts of the world, whether a Republican or a Democrat is in office in Washington, D.C., in the White House, is probably of secondary importance. And in some ways, it can be seen as better if it's a Democrat, in some ways better if it's a Republican. I do think on climate, which after all, we have one world, on climate, there's a huge difference. I mean, Republicans are basically climate deniers. They're unhinged. They're anti-science. They are so therefore willing to let the temperature of the world go up and up. The Democrats are not where they should be, but they're not at least climate deniers, so that's important. In terms of UNESCO, the United Nations, the Republicans are way worse than the Democrats. They don't believe in international cooperation. But when you get to militarism and you get to trade policy, then it's really hard from outside the U.S. to see a real difference between the two parties.
Biden administration just 2 months ago released national security, its version of national security. There are two issues that going to be addressed in this document. One of them is global warming, health issues, international health issues, and so forth and so on. And And the other one is this division between autocracy and democracies. You see, one of them, it's these two issues don't come together. They are described as
Mhm.
perpendicular to each other.
Right, right.
How we can bring them together? We cannot. We by dividing the world in two totally different blocks. How you can negotiate with China, with Russia, with great powers about the global warming?
Yeah, you're really, I think, putting your finger on a very important contradiction that exists. It's a contradiction of, you might say, liberal neoliberalism, the Democratic Party version of neoliberalism. They want to have their cake and eat it too. They want to say they're humanists, and they want to run a warfare state that is predatory in terms of maximizing profits within some limits. The hostility to workers is much greater among the right wing, among the Republican parties, but still there's a belief that capitalism is the way to go. Neoliberal policies are best with some modification with public investment and so forth. And so that contradiction is to such an extreme extent. It's a kind of a fiction that's being created, or a fiction that's being maintained, or an effort to maintain the mythology that somehow you can have a humanistic foreign policy, you can have a world order that is predatory in economic terms, but it's still going to treat people well. And oh, by the way, we're going to deal with the climate crisis. We're not going to the reality is you're not going to deal with the climate crisis unless you deal with predatory capitalism and roll back the power of corporate capitalism. It's just impossible to do what needs to be done on climate and still allow the power of corporate capitalism to exist. And so in a document like those issued by the Pentagon and so forth, they're trying to square a circle, which can't be done except rhetorically and in terms of media messaging and so forth. And I think it goes to the challenge that people in the United States and around the world have. There is, during the George W. Bush administration, right after 9/11, when he said, you're either with us or you're with the evildoers, then some Democrats, or some journalists in the United States would mock that a little bit. They would say, oh, well, that's too Manichaean. You're dividing the world into evil and saintliness, and that's not the real world. And yet, really, there's a lot of accommodation to that approach and the echoing to that approach. I don't believe that it's feasible to say there's one world movement for freedom. I think that's overstated. And while I was a very strong Bernie Sanders supporter, I was a delegate for Bernie Sanders to the national conventions of 2016 and 2020, I think it's an exaggerated notion that we have one movement around the world. It just flattens and ignores the tremendous intricacy and complexity of different societies and different facets of movements and so forth. But in general, I think there should be a single standard of human rights. And we don't say that it's okay to suppress freedom of expression. No, freedom of expression is a universal value, like in the UN Declaration of Human Rights, and we should support that. At the same time, we don't get to run the world. There's a standard bumper sticker in the United States. It's an American flag, and it says, these colors don't run. It's a sort of militaristic expression. We won't fail to stand up militarily when we're in a military conflict and so forth. These colors don't run. The counterpoint message to that is these colors don't run the world. But that's a very different notion, because really the standard view in the United States is that we should aspire to run the world. And I think it's become more and more of a problem as the Democratic Party has been more and more aggressive towards Russia, for instance, because then it's an attitude, well, even though we don't, in retrospect, support the idea of regime change as occurred in Iraq, we've seen it didn't work out as it was being touted to work out. There's a tacit wish for regime change in Russia. So how can you have a world where one nuclear superpower is aspiring to regime change in the other nuclear? It's insane. It's a prescription for global holocaust. And even though the neoliberal rhetoric might include we have to deal with the twin threats of climate emergency, and even though it's not talked about nearly enough, the nuclear war danger, in form of practice, there has to be a recognition that the neoliberal model just cannot, not only cannot deal with the climate emergency, but it propels us closer to nuclear conflagration because of the militarism that is inherent in the profit taking. I mean, it's enormously profitable. These arms that are being shipped to Ukraine equal billions of dollars in profits just in the last year for U.S. military contractors. And when we look at another aspect of foreign policy, for instance, the Israeli government that's just come in, the Netanyahu government, is abhorrent by any standards. It's an apartheid government to an extreme, even more than before. And yet U.S. foreign policy, while Democrats might prefer to have a more centrist government in charge in Israel, it's going to accommodate to Netanyahu. Also, Bolsonaro. I mean, yes, Trump loved Bolsonaro. Probably Democrats preferred that he not be in power. But I have to tell you, if it's between Lula and Bolsonaro, a lot of Democrats, for them, they wouldn't care. You know, one or the other is equally bad or good as far as they're concerned, because it's ultimately a lens that is seen through, that's tinted the colors of the United States, the red, white, and blue. And so in a sense, the window on the world from the bipartisan view of Washington is tinted red, white, and blue. And of course, that's preposterous. I mean, the United States has, what, 5% of the world's population? And yet the arrogance that is so inherent in U.S. foreign policy is totally in contradiction to the human realities on the planet.
A good point you brought up about Bernie Sanders. I remember he was running against Hillary, and his campaign was fueled by small donors. Those people with he didn't have any big donor, that's Goldman Sachs or something like that.
Right.
But unfortunately, I don't know. As an outsider, I'd say the nomination was stolen from him. What I get from the outside, because I thought he was the future. He was those days. He was the future for me. And
yeah, I agree. I think that I know I'm 70 years old, and so I've seen quite a few presidential campaigns. He is the best electoral leader in the United States in my lifetime. I think you'd have to go back to Franklin Delano Roosevelt to find somebody who had huge impact nationally to shift the range of discourse, the so-called Overton window, what is possible. And he has been transformative, not only or primarily as an individual, but because of the social movements that he was part of. And that's what's really extraordinary. Unfortunately, I would say, unfortunately, that it's very unusual for a prominent U.S. politician who actually is being elected to a fairly high office to be part of really social movements. And Bernie Sanders has always been part of progressive social movements. And I think, you know, in a general way, I would compare him to Lula that way. But in the United States, that's very unusual. And so what happened in this case is that his national campaign for president became possible because of the organizing. First, a dozen years ago, the Occupy movement. That really was the outgrowth. I mean, I was lucky enough to be in Seattle in 1999, where all the work that people had done around trade issues, first GATT and WTO, came out in the streets. And it was part of that awareness that nationally and globally, we have to look at and challenge economic inequality. Then the Occupy movement coming up, a dozen years later, and that popularized the idea of the 99% versus the 1%. And then we had more and more focus then on income inequality. And then that opened up a whole range where Bernie Sanders was able to walk through, and for the campaigns of 2016 and 2020, it was truly part of a movement. And I think that we now see the limits of the business as usual in responding to that movement, because frankly, while Bernie still makes a big difference in Congress, he doesn't have as much leverage in the party as a few years ago. And this is the struggle ahead. And by the way, at rootsaction.org, which everybody around the world is invited to sign up for our action alerts at rootsaction.org, we have launched the Don't Run Joe campaign to block Biden from running for president again, because we, I think, really need to clear him out of the way so we have a better opportunity. It's unclear that Bernie Sanders would run if Biden doesn't. He's made clear he will not run against Biden if Biden chooses to try to be the nominee of the Democratic Party. So this is all to say that only by organizing from the grassroots will any of this really change substantially, for reasons that I think you've referred to: the superstructure, the way in which the ruling circles, economic power, political, and media, what we could call the military-industrial surveillance media complex, they've got dominant control. And unless people can organize more effectively from the bottom up, we will be run from the top down.
I see. And let's get into Ukraine war. Do you think that it was possible to avoid this war from the beginning?
I think it was possible to avoid this war. At the same time that the Russian government bears total responsibility for the carnage going on in Ukraine, NATO has really been an aggressive force in the sense of moving up to the Russian border. And we can, even if we set aside the history that when the Berlin Wall fell, the first Bush administration promised Russia, at that time the Soviet Union, that there would be no expansion of NATO, even 1 inch eastward. That promise was broken again and again, a dozen countries up to the Russian border. That is a backdrop for then the last year, where truly, and I think Jeffrey Sachs, among others, has pointed this out, the United States never negotiated seriously over the Ukraine crisis last year or the beginning of this year. It was completely recalcitrant. The United States government basically was unwilling to genuinely seek any sort of diplomatic solution to the crisis. And then Biden, the White House, State Department said around January of this 2022, we think Russia will invade. Well, that turned out to be true. But if the US government thought that Russia would invade, then why didn't it engage in diplomacy? For one thing, I think your question is right on point. For one thing, the US could have said, we will make sure that Ukraine never joins NATO. But the US is absolutely unwilling, was unwilling, and even now is unwilling to make that promise. And, it goes back to this arrogance of power, tinting the window on the world from Washington, red, white, and blue, where can you imagine if the Warsaw Pact still existed, or Russian forces had an alliance with Canada or Mexico, put missiles on the border, the Rio Grande River to the south of the U.S. or along the Canadian border to the north. I mean, that would be absolutely intolerable to the United States government. And yet the U.S. government has proceeded as though Russia should accept this, no problem, to have NATO expanding up to its borders and even open the possibility of Ukraine joining. One other thing I would say is that in recent years, and this again, as you allude to, is an example of the very dangerous continuity and agreement between the Democratic and Republican parties in terms of foreign policy, where these supposed defensive missiles, the ABM systems, were put in Romania, were put in Poland. Well, they can be retrofitted and adjusted very easily to be offensive missiles, and they're just very close to Moscow. So this is a kind of insanity. I mean, I have on my bookshelf here a great book, which I just recommend to anybody, by Daniel Ellsberg, the great whistleblower, the Pentagon Papers leaker. And he wrote a book that came out a few years ago called The Doomsday Machine. And he really spells out the way in which the mentality in place among the nuclear superpowers in particular, and he focuses on the US, but Russia, clearly there's a lot of similarities. It's a kind of a deranged approach. I would parallel it to a corporation where the leadership looks at the next few quarters. If you talk to somebody in leadership of a huge corporation and you say, well, but what about 10 years from now? What about 20 years from now? They'll likely say, that's not on my desk. I'm concerned with the next few quarters. And meanwhile, that's an attitude that prevails in Washington around nuclear weapons. I mean, it's a form of nuclear terrorism towards the entire planet. That's what we're dealing with. And in Daniel Ellsberg's book, he quotes the philosopher Nietzsche, who says, and I'm paraphrasing here, but it's pretty close. He says, in individuals, insanity is rare. In groups and governments and nations, it's common. And I think that very much applies to the approach to nuclear weapons that prevails among those at the top of governments that are wielding those weapons and really threatening the world with them. And I think that's a role of what has long been called the non-aligned nations, those that are not aligned with, in this case, Russia or the United States, to demand some sanity because our entire world is at stake.
And I really don't understand why this sentiment against Russia comes from where? Why? It doesn't matter. You as we talked before, it doesn't matter you have a Republican or Democrat in the office. It continues the same, specifically toward Russia, because it means, as you know, Russia tried to solve these conflicts in Ukraine during 2014, 2015 Minsk I and Minsk II agreements, which turned out recently that Angela Merkel said that we were buying time. We were not. Ukraine was not going to abide by these agreements. We were buying time for Ukraine to build up its military. You see that these kind of when you make an agreement and don't honor it, you nobody forces you to make an agreement, but when you make it, you have to honor it. How we can overcome these challenges by these politicians all around the world?
Well, these politicians are leaders who are not what people deserve. When I went to Iran about 10 years ago, more 12 years ago, and I was talking with people, and one person who was selling garments in the bazaar said, people everywhere, we want peace, and our leaders are getting in the way of what we want. And I think that's very true. In the case of Russia, we have the example, we're told Boris Johnson from Britain intervened early this year to prevent meaningful negotiations between Zelensky and Putin governments. And I think that it's a view that this is a zero-sum game, that the world is carved up and the United States has to have as big a piece of the pie as possible. I think it's a classic empire attitude. It's very hard for people in the United States, and certainly the leadership will never acknowledge, this is an empire. The United States more and more relies on its military, because its economic prowess is not what it was, to enforce its empire capacities. And finding a rationality from it, I think, is difficult, because it depends on what your standards are. If your standards are what would be better for everybody on the planet in terms of nurturing lives, protecting the environment, having safeguards to prevent wars, then you would have one set of standards, which I think are the rational, humane standards. If it's how can the United States advance what is commonly in the mass media in this country called national security, then they define that as make the United States as dominant and strong as possible on the planet, and look out for other people who might, and other forces that might get in the way. There was a CIA agent who later became a critic, a progressive critic of the Central Intelligence Agency, John Stockwell, and he wrote a book titled In Search of Enemies. And I think that is a great description of the United States foreign policy, especially militarily. I mean, when you think about it, the Soviet Union and communist China, of course, China is not really communist anymore. The Soviet Union was a gift to the United States, because we know, the United States was supporting bloodthirsty dictators in Latin America, the Somozas and so many, for a century or more. What was it? The general said, I was a racketeer for business in Nicaragua. This has been historic. This was going on for so long. And then when the excuse could be used, we're fighting communism. And then that was a lie, a rationale. It was a rationalization. So you have Arbenz in 1954 in Guatemala, overthrown with U.S. help. You have, of course, the terrible coup in Brazil in the middle of 1960s that ushered in fascism there. You had, of course, support for Pinochet's coup in Chile. We have many other examples. And the rationale in the United States was, well, maybe it's not pretty, but we have to stop the communists. It was like completely a vicious, lying rationalization for inflicting tremendous suffering and attacks on democracy in the hemisphere. Okay, then 1990 comes along. Then we're supposedly at the end of the Cold War. There's no more Cold War. Well, you have to find more enemies. How can you justify a huge Pentagon budget without other enemies? And so 9/11 was sort of a gift then. I mean, there was supposed to be a peace dividend in the 1990s. It didn't really materialize much, but at least it wasn't this huge escalator of military spending that's so lucrative for the military contractors in the United States. But then 9/11 came along. And at that point, there could gear up the misnamed so-called war on terror. And so that was extremely lucrative. And all of a sudden, there were new companies and more profitable companies in the Washington, D.C. area, around the Pentagon, around the National Security Agency in Maryland and near Baltimore and so forth. And they were able to gin up tremendous spending, especially for these intel outfits, and of course, then the war in Afghanistan and Iraq. And so that was a boon for them. But how long could that last? I mean, after all, 9/11 was inflicted with box cutters. How do you justify year after year billions and billions of dollars of new expenditures on weaponry against box cutters? I mean, in the longer run, or suicide cars packed with explosives. So they're able to rationalize it because of the war in Afghanistan and Iraq. But then that has sort of dissipated. Well, there's a tremendous need for suitable enemies politically and financially for the war profiteers, the blood money by the billions of dollars. So this is sort of a long-winded way of sort of charting a general evolution to Russia. Now it's back to Russia. And if you go to the presidential debate, one of them between President Barack Obama and Mitt Romney in 2012, when Romney talked about how Russia was a threat, Obama responded, "Oh, come on, you're living in the past about Russia being a threat," because they thought Russia would be sort of still domesticated to the U.S. Desires, as Yeltsin had been. But Putin found himself crossed up by, and you alluded to this earlier, Nima, about how can these people just go around lying all the time, not agree to not follow through adhering to treaties that they signed. And, I think Putin got fed up, not to justify in any way his policies, but he got really fed up with the U.S. lying about how it was going to adhere to agreements with Russia. And so it gets us to now, which I think is very, very dangerous, because the forces that are prevailing in terms of U.S. foreign policy inside this country, they've got Russia totally demonized. They have China largely demonized. And it's really up to activists in the United States, and it's up to activists and leaders in other countries of the world to say that is completely unacceptable, and we're not going to put up with it.
Yes, exactly. But when you see in this war something amazing, pretty amazing happened, which is called the sabotage of the Nord Stream pipeline, which cut the gas from Russia to Germany. After that, the mainstream media I was watching, it's so amazing that there are military experts coming out. It was Russia that did that. It was Russia. Why? If Russia can just turn it off, why he has to? It's so amazing. But after you see these sabotage of nuclear of the Nord Stream pipeline, it doesn't suffer. Russians are suffering more than Russians. We have Europeans are suffering. We came a long way after the pandemic, and we are struggling with this new conflict in Ukraine. The international economy is in turmoil, and you see one after another we have a new crisis coming up. How do you see these series of events?
Yeah, you're reminding me of another example of what we could call seeing huge numbers of people as expendable. You're talking about a policy, a U.S. policy, and Russia has done this as well. From the U.S. standpoint, so many people are expendable. There are choices. Can we help people in Europe, even those who are allies, or can we pursue this militaristic approach, this zero-sum game? And the choice has been in Washington, we're going to pursue this zero-sum game. This is absolutely opposite of what Mikhail Gorbachev was calling for. He wanted a Europe that cooperated as part of a world community that cooperated. This is a path for sanity. Unfortunately, it's rejected again and again because of the priorities. Priorities are maximizing profits for these military contractors and geopolitical advantage for the U.S., market share, and all the rest of it. You reminded me of something that is in Daniel Ellsberg's book. And he was, although he's best known as somebody who worked on Vietnam war policies and then leaked the Pentagon Papers, before that, he was a nuclear war planner in the John F. Kennedy presidential administration and early into the Johnson administration. And he writes in his book, Daniel Ellsberg writes that when he gets access to top secret documents, he sees that the Pentagon is planning for a nuclear war that not only would kill vast numbers of people in Russia and China, but would kill hundreds of millions of people in Western Europe. Those are our allies, but they're expendable. And we're talking 6-7 decades later, really. And it's the same basic attitude. It's like, look, we have our priorities. If a lot of people have to die as a consequence, well, that's really a shame, but they're not my kids, they're not my relatives. And that's really, we probably will feel really bad about it. When you look at military spending, for instance, I mean, you could take a small fraction of the Pentagon budget, and if you were determined to do it, you could end most of the malnutrition and starvation on the entire planet. But that's just not a priority.
With all that, with all the explains that you gave us, how do you see the future of the NATO?
Well, unfortunately, I think that NATO's future is very bright. And at rootsaction.org, for 12 years since we started, we have advocated for the elimination of NATO because while it was put forward as a defensive alliance against the Soviet Union, after the Soviet Union collapsed in around 1990, rather than disband, NATO went in search of enemies. And also, since there wasn't a major military force to defend Europe against, it went on the offense. And so if we look at the history of NATO, the shameful history, in 1999, central to the bombing of Yugoslavia, then the bombing of Libya. And the mentality is, whenever possible, to just bomb people from the sky. And I shouldn't forget NATO's major role in the war on Afghanistan for so many years. And so the rationale was, very tenuous. And I think 2 or 3 years ago, there was significant capacity to at least reevaluate from Europe, NATO, certainly grassroots attitudes in Germany and elsewhere. There was some possibility of modifying, if not ending, NATO and its role. But Vladimir Putin gave NATO, ironically enough, a tremendous gift by attacking Ukraine. Then it became extremely difficult to make a resonating critique of NATO inside Europe. And of course, now there are all these countries that say they want to join, Finland, Sweden. And so I think NATO has a very strong future ahead of it, a very dangerous future, because it's run by demagogues who are serving the arms merchants. And it also is run by people who are basically, they're basically thugs. I hate to say it. They're thugs in business suits, and they're serving huge economic interests and profiteers at the same time that they are damaging people's lives. So alas, the future of NATO seems to be quite bright by its own standards. And I don't think we should be defeatist about it just because we need to be realistic about it. There still needs to be a call for a world community as much as possible that has standards that support life instead of threaten life. And this is where, again, I think non-aligned countries, Brazil, India, smaller countries, have a very important role to play, that the leadership needs to step forward and be encouraged to step forward in forums like the United Nations, in international conferences, in being heard around the world to say that we're suffering from this tremendous dualism, the polarity that says, you know, you're either on one side or the other. We need to be on the side of humanity.
And sometimes when I think about this crisis in this conflict in Russia, I always think what option left for Putin to choose. I come out with nothing, because it seems that he was desperate. He had no he had two agreement, as we talked before, Minsk one and Minsk two, that it failed, and he wanted to build up on these agreements. Nobody was interested in negotiations, and as we recall the uh, Cuban Missile Crisis, when Kennedy felt this threat from the Soviet Union in Cuba. Cuba was far away comparing to Ukraine. It's doorstep of Russia. It's not even Cuba for Russia. You know, it's Europe is Cuba for Russia. But at least Kennedy had somebody in his Khrushchev was eager to negotiate with him. But Putin has nobody to understand what he's talking about. It seems that everybody just says no. He's a evil. He's a new Hitler, and nobody cares what this guy is talking about.
This goes to the lack of diplomacy. After the Cuban Missile Crisis, President Kennedy gave a speech at American University. And one of the things he said was that when you have a confrontation and escalating tensions, particularly between nuclear powers, you should never put the other leader in the position that they may lose everything. They may lose their own power. You don't, I'm using my own words to summarize, you don't just shove them up against the wall and put them in a corner. And yet that's really what the US government has done in concert with NATO in terms of Putin. And I hasten to add, I don't in any way justify Russia's invasion or at this point 10 months of warfare and killing in Ukraine. I think the Russian government has complete responsibility and should be condemned for that. At the same time, if the US government and the NATO countries really wanted to prevent this war or to end it now, they would be engaging in genuine diplomacy. And they have not done that. They didn't do it a year ago. They didn't do it 11 months ago. They're not doing it now.
In February, that Putin started invading Ukraine, all the mainstream media of the United States were talking about Putin wants to subsume Ukraine. He's going to take over Ukraine. He's marching toward Europe. But it turned out he was not going to do that. He was going to take these regions of Russians, predominantly Russian speakers.
I think Putin wants a Ukraine that's not part of the NATO apparatus. Clearly, that's where things were heading, even though there was a lot of denial. But I think a year or two or three ago, that's where things were going. There were powerful forces in NATO, Washington wanting Ukraine to become part of NATO. And I think for understandable reasons, that was intolerable for Putin to accept. In the U.S. media and U.S. politics, and I wrote about this in my book, War Made Easy, one of the boilerplates has been the Hitler analogies, Munich, Chamberlain, accommodation, so forth, and capitulation. And if you look at the last 40 years, Manuel Noriega was compared to Hitler, Slobodan Milosevic, going way back, Ho Chi Minh was Hitler, certainly Saddam Hussein was Hitler. I mean, all of these analogies have harked back to the lead up into World War II, but we ought to look at it in terms of realism. And I just think it's absurd to claim that Putin's some kind of Hitler who wants to roll over Europe. It just makes no sense from any rational point of view. I do think that because of how things have unfolded in the last year, everybody's upped the ante. And, Putin, whether his forces can pull it off or not, he wants to dominate Ukraine in a way that a year ago he didn't want to. He just wanted a neutral Ukraine. And I think that was just unacceptable. There was a really sad, outrageous moment very early in 2022, before the invasion of Ukraine, at a news conference with President Biden. And he was asked by a reporter, would you accept the idea of Ukraine not joining NATO? And this was a historic moment. And the response from President Biden was, I'm not going to make that promise. That's up to Ukraine and NATO. If they wanted, they have a right to join NATO if they want to. Well, that's crazy. That was just a fateful, terrible choice to make, to respond in that way. Something that has happened in the last number of years, which is very disturbing, disappointing, is that the Russian government has aligned itself with racism, white supremacy, to the point that, as far as I know, the only neo-Nazi forces that are opposed to Russia in Europe are in Ukraine. And so you have the brigade and so forth, and they are neo-Nazis, and they hate the Russians, and they don't want any negotiations coming from Ukraine. That is real. But then you go across elsewhere in Europe, and you see that the Russian line has increasingly aligned itself with white supremacy. And it's just, it's a quirk of history. I think it's trying to drive a wedge. And so, cheering on Le Pen in France and some of the right-wing parties elsewhere in Europe, Hungary, so forth. Paradoxically, on the one hand, Russia's aligning itself with these white supremacists. And yet, I think part of, and maybe most of what explains it, is complete power politics and opportunism. Because from the vantage point of Putin, if there's a political tendency in Western Europe or Eastern Europe that is aligned with the United States, that's bad. If there's a political tendency like Le Pen or this neo-fascist now running the Italian government, if they want to have a softer line towards Russia, maybe sympathetic, then we're going to say good things about them. And I think that's just, it's power politics, but we should reject it.
And how do you see the role of BRICS in making, because we know that the United States has two has two elements, two powerful elements: sanctions and wars. When sanctions bring down the government, make them so weak, it's time to war. Go there and topple the regime. How do you see the role of BRICS in this story of the United States?
I think there's tremendous potential in terms of messaging around the planet and also encouraging, brokering, maybe even hosting negotiations. For instance, the breakdown recently of the Iran nuclear deal, which is completely the fault of the United States because under Trump, the U.S., and that is an example of differences between Republicans and Democrats in foreign policy, the Republicans killed the Iran nuclear deal, and now for various reasons, including the repression in Iran being used as an excuse by the U.S., the Iran nuclear deal is not reinstated. It's a very important deal. It was imposed. It was created. We needed it. Israel was against it. Saudi Arabia was against it. But we got it. Then it got canceled by Trump. Now it's not back. That's a tragedy. And so BRICS countries, others can and should, in those kind of situations, do what they can to jumpstart, restart, invigorate existing negotiations and to create new ones, I think, are very important. That is, that's really the future. It's the future of the planet because unipolarity is destructive, dangerous, and out. And even though in the US, there's a struggle out of the power centers to maintain or assert that there's a unipolar world, except for in a somewhat military sense, I just think that's the past. It's not the present. It's certainly not the future. And so other countries must assert themselves to be a counterweight to the insanity coming out of Washington and often out of Moscow as well. I think an example, a positive example, is that Lula issued a statement in support of Julian Assange. And that's one example of what we need because right now we have in the United States this attitude that leadership means, unless you're aligned with Russia, leadership means that you go along with whatever Washington wants to do in the name of national security. And to take that example, Julian Assange should not be in prison at all. And he shouldn't have been indicted. He shouldn't be under threat of being taken to the United States where he clearly would not get a fair trial. It's about freedom of the press. It sort of goes back to a single standard of human rights. If Assange should be in prison, then publishers of the New York Times and the Washington Post should be in prison as well if you're using classified material. So just to sort of, recap, I think that BRICS and other countries that have the vantage point that Washington lacks really could make a huge difference for the future.
And final question. I am so curious about Bernie Sanders. Do you think he's gonna run again?
I think it's possible. He hasn't ruled it out. And in terms of the politics in this country, we have this pending decision from Biden about whether he's going to seek re-election. And anybody who is watching and listening, I invite you to go to our website, don'trunjoe.org, and sign up, and we can send you updates. We're working very hard to discourage Biden from running again. Unfortunately, under the name of party loyalty, if Biden does proceed to run for re-election, Bernie Sanders has said he will not run. And this is his last shot. He's 81. So I can keep my fingers crossed. If Biden chooses not to run, it's unclear whether Bernie will, but he might. And that voice is so important. He was chair of the Senate Budget Committee for the last 2 years, a powerful position. He shifted over to a Health and Labor Committee chair. And he really is providing a voice for a movement for movements, plural, that have been pretty much locked out of the corridors of power. I do want to say, I think this dialogue that we've had is really important so we can break down the barriers that the corporate mass media are creating between countries. So I really appreciate the invitation to speak with you.